Hey everyone, welcome. Today I want to talk about the recent news that the White House has said that Tylenol, or as Trump so eloquently put it,
I said, well, let's see how we say that. Acetaminophen, acetaminophen.
causes autism. I know this is a very touchy subject to tackle, but that proclamation was made on very shaky scientific footing. And honestly, this is going to hurt a lot of pregnant women. I know that if a loved one has autism, right, you want answers, right? Why did this happen to us? And frankly, the answer is no one really knows. And I know that that sounds like it's a cop out, and maybe it is, but I think that's true. The world is chaotic, it's random. No one really knows what causes autism, right? And sometimes people just get unlucky. How does all of this relate to economics? And I would say, contrary to popular opinion, we are scientists. And part of our collective expertise is research methodology. And that is really what I want to focus on today in talking about these autism papers. So today I want to talk about three things: general kind of research methodology. I want to talk about backdoors and confounders and use those to critique the papers that the White House is citing. And then three, talk about why we have seen an increase in the rate of observed autism. Let's actually start with that last one first, since I think it is partially motivating this entire discussion. And according to the CDC, observed autism spectrum disorder, or ASD for short, rates have increased over about the past 20-ish years. And I'm showing that on a graph right now. And the first thing that I would kind of note is that this data is a little bit noisy, right? We have upper bounds approaching 9% later in the sample, although the average is about 3%. But as you can see from the graph, this rate is increasing over time. And so does that mean that the actual autism rate is increasing over time? Well, that's certainly a possibility, but I would argue that we have actually just gotten better at diagnosing autism over the years, or other, conditions or things like that that maybe were kind of in their separate bin before are now fall under that umbrella of ASD. Put another way, we all have that crazy uncle who says autism wasn't a thing back in their day, right? They just had crazy people. While this same uncle is obsessed with looking at birds or playing with his model trains or whatever. I would argue that now we are actually probably accurately measuring the autism rate relative to where we were even 20 years ago. Go back 30, 40, 50 years. We're doing much better there. And that probably is reflecting in this increase in numbers. If you let me digress for just a second, this fallacy of, I would say, more accurately measuring something and seeing that incidence rate go up, it's not unique to just this issue. So what I want to talk about very briefly is sexual harassment prevalence at the U.S. Air Force Academy, where I currently work. Another very hot button sensitive topic, but one that we should talk about. Like most, if not all, colleges across the United States, the Air Force Academy has a sexual harassment and sexual violence issue. Sexual harassment and sexual violence, they are real issue. They harm real people, and women are obviously the vast majority of the victims here. What makes the Air Force Academy unique is that it had this additional kind of military layer on top of the typical, issue of shoving a whole bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds in the same place in close proximity to each other. That military layer made it for a very long time that it was very difficult for victims of sexual harassment or sexual violence to report this abuse. So I'm talking no anonymous reporting, essentially having to face your accuser, the built-in kind of hierarchy of different ranks within the grades, right? This is some real kind of draconian shit that made it essentially impossible for victims to step forward without fear of retribution. Now, to the Air Force Academy's credit, they have made huge strides on this in the past couple of years, which is something that absolutely should be applauded. A byproduct of this, though, is that there has been an increase in the reported, and a real emphasis on that word reported there, rates of sexual harassment. And leadership here has been very adamant about trying to reduce this, which, of course, we should always be trying to reduce any incident or prevalence of sexual violence on campus. Obviously, if you think about it for just a second, I don't think the actual rate of sexual harassment has gone up. We've just made it easier for people to report it. So reported rates have gone up. I would argue probably the real rates are going down. Probably for the first time in ever, we are actually somewhat accurately measuring the real sexual harassment rates at the Air Force Academy. All of this is a very long-winded way of saying I think the same thing is true for autism diagnoses in the US as well. Has the autism rate gone up? Maybe, I don't know. But I would argue that, again, we are probably now closer to reporting true rates of ASD in the population than we were before. And then that is manifesting itself as looking like an increase in the rate of autism. So with all of that said, let's talk about research design and let's jump right in. Let's pretend that we were tasked with finding out if Tylenol usage actually causes autism. So from a general kind of research design perspective, or if you want to go back to kind of scientific method, we would be able to run an experiment to answer this question. So let's not get into specifics, but let's kind of very quickly throw together an experiment to measure this. So we could have a group of, say, women who are not allowed to take Tylenol at all during their pregnancy. And let's also even just say, 18 months postpartum, right? They are not allowed to have any Tylenol. This would be our control group. We could then have, say, a second group where they are allowed to take kind of moderate amounts of Tylenol throughout their pregnancy and a little bit postpartum. And then we can also have a group where they are encouraged to take a lot of Tylenol. So we have our kind of control group, and then we have two treatment groups, one kind of moderate, one severe Tylenol usage. What is critical to having then a solid experiment is that assignment to any of these groups, whether it be control or one of those two treatment groups, it's random. So there is no kind of selecting people on characteristics that we think would either favorably show that there is no link or try and show that there is a link, right? As soon as you start doing that, you're putting your thumb on the scale. That's not a valid experiment anymore. Random assignment is the gold standard for running experiments. Basically, the logic behind that is that any other kind of characteristics that we think might be correlated with Tylenol usage and subsequent autism rates, those are the same in those general populations. We are effectively breaking the link between Tylenol usage and some of these kind of underlying factors that we think might also cause autism in the future. We track these women over time, we look at the observed kind of ASD rates, and we get an awesome publication to put on our CV to put in our tenure package. Now, as I hope that I was kind of describing the logistics of running this experiment, alarm bells were going off in your head, right? This, from a kind of practical standpoint, is not reasonable, but more importantly, morally, this is just awful, right? You cannot do this. It is incredibly unethical. We are forcing women to either refrain from taking any pain relievers if they need them, or we are essentially forcing pain relievers on women if they do not need them. And if there really was a link between Tylenol and subsequent autism rates, we are then forcing these kids maybe to have a higher incidence of ASD than they would otherwise, right? So from that perspective, right, if we kind of think about the first rule of medicine, do no harm, we are absolutely doing harm here. We should not do it. Also, enforcing women to not take Tylenol, take some, or basically force feed them Tylenol, it's not enforceable. So this experiment cannot be done. What is done in practice then to answer research questions like this, where experiments are not feasible? The answer is observational studies, which basically means let the world run as it is, and then we get data as we can to hopefully answer this research question. And this is where I feel that as an economist, I can comment on the methodologies chosen by these papers, because like this particular issue, does Tylenol cause autism where an experiment isn't feasible, tons and tons of economics research questions are also not practically done via an experiment. As a result of this impracticality of experiments in economics, we have developed a very robust toolkit to try and tease out causality from observational studies. I'm not going to delve into that, but if you're interested, take an econometrics course or let me know in the comments. I'm happy to talk about these kind of methodologies in future videos. As a result of being able to try and tease out causality from observational studies, I want to talk about what I saw in the papers that the White House mentioned and critique them to basically show that I don't actually believe there is a causal link between Tylenol usage and autism, as the White House is claiming. The most recent paper, one that got a lot of press, was a recent August 2025 publication. The papers that I'm basically citing or critiquing here, I will include in the description of the video. That August 2025 paper was just a comprehensive review of prior work, right? They didn't actually do any original work on their own. They just basically summarized and critiqued prior work. So let's look at that prior work. But what I will say is that the papers that they seemed to select had a very kind of pro Tylenol causes autism bent, which to me is a little bit sketchy in and of itself. Let's use a directed acyclic graph, also called a DAG, to discuss the issues that I have with these general papers. And again, I'm not going to dive into any of the papers in kind of particular, just they all more or less follow the same kind of formula, and I want to provide my general critique of that. Let's say that we are interested in mapping this, potential relationship between Tylenol usage and subsequent ASD rates. So we can represent that with the DAG that I'm showing right here. And it is very simple, right? We have Tylenol, arrow to autism. If that drawing reflected kind of the reality of the world we lived in, that would be fine. Then we would be able to essentially just say, look at autism rates, look at Tylenol usage, choose your, statistical method. As economists, we love regression, and see if there's a relationship there. The big issue behind just that simplistic of a relationship is that we know that's not how the world works. And this kind of presence of underlying variables that may be affecting both our treatment, which in this case is Tylenol usage, and our outcome, autism rates, we call those confounders. And the path that we take are called backdoor paths. And here I want to give credit to Nick Huntington Klein's amazing book, The Effect. I am not sponsored by him or whatever. I've used it to teach my own econometrics classes. It's fantastic and very readable. Highly recommend. So just to kind of reiterate, a confounder is a variable that causes variation, right, or changes in both my treatment, Tylenol in this case, and my outcome, autism. And it is the one that is causing those, which is why we have the arrows pointing towards those two boxes in the DAG that I am showing now. Basically, just think there is a kind of third variable at play that causes changes in both variables. And if we don't find a way to control for it or account for it, we may erroneously be linking Tylenol and autism when there actually is not an arrow there at all, no direct link. This is the crux for observational studies. There are likely hundreds of these confounder variables creating these backdoor paths between our treatment and our outcome, and you need to control for all of them to, as Huntington Klein would say, close all those back doors. If any of those remain open, you're either in one of two worlds. One, if there is a true relationship, you are biasing it, which means that you are not correctly estimating, say, how much additional Tylenol causes, additional incidence rates of autism, or you may be erroneously saying there is a relationship when there is not. And that is what we would call a spurious correlation. Our spurious correlation is it appears that these two variables are related when really there is some confounder variable that is causing both that makes them look like they are related, even though in actuality they are not. If I could control for that confounder, that correlation disappears. Max here with a quick demonstration on how backdoors and confounders would work. So here in Stata, obviously the last video I used R, here I'm using Stata just to show the different softwares that are available to you as economists. Up here, we have our do file, so if you ever wanted to replicate this, you can go ahead and do that. But basically, what I want to show here is using economist's favorite tool, which is regression. We are going to look at how autism is correlated with Tylenol usage in this case. And this is just data that I've made up, but I think it illustrates an important point. So if we go ahead and look at this, what this that I'm highlighting right here says is that if a mother used Tylenol at all during her pregnancy, her child is 13 percentage points more likely to have autism later in life in this. And with this associated p-value here, basically this means very statistically significant. This would be, for those of you, quick statistics side note, the p-value represents the probability that we would observe something as extreme as this result if the null hypothesis, which is there was no link between Tylenol and autism, was true. So it seems like right now I've basically shown, well, there's a link between autism and Tylenol. But what I wanted to show you with Stata here is this idea of backdoors. So what if there was something that was causing both autism rates later in life and Tylenol usage during pregnancy for women? And the variable I created here is fever. So did a mom have a fever during her pregnancy? If yes, then she chose Tylenol. And let's say that there's something about having a fever that makes your child more likely to have autism in the future. And so I'll show a quick DAG basically depicting what that looks like. And to show you, in this first regression that I just ran, we weren't controlling for fever. And so we are erroneously drawing this link between Tylenol usage and subsequent autism. So if I was to go back and rerun this and include fever as another control variable, so essentially account for it, close the back door in the parlance of Nick Huntington Klein, what you see is that that Tylenol effect disappears entirely. It becomes essentially zero, and it is no longer statistically significant. And that is really the crux that I'm trying to argue behind these papers, and what I think erroneously is what's happening with the White House's report. The papers that I describe, they aren't as naive as to just purely look at a pure relationship between autism and Tylenol. As I mentioned, the G2020 paper does a really good job of controlling for a lot of confounding variables. But as I said, it's essentially impossible to control for every possible backdoor, and that is either going to, I think, overstate the relationship, if any, that exists between Tylenol usage and subsequent autism, or, as I kind of demonstrated here, it is going to manufacture one out of thin air. And so we need to be really careful in presenting these results to not potentially mislead audiences. So, quick stats detour and kind of practical application aside, back to the video. As I said earlier, economists, because we have done this so much, we do a really good job of exploiting kind of policy changes or other changes in the world to isolate, hopefully, we think, causal variation, what I would call quasi-experimental variation. If you want a fancy vocab word to impress your friends, just say quasi-experimental. But these techniques are absent from the papers that that 2025 review paper is citing. And the reason is it's hard to create quasi-experimental variation here, right? We are in pure observational world. To these papers' credit, they do make attempts to control for confounders. And there's one paper in particular, the G2020 paper, that really takes this quite seriously and includes a lot of confounding variables, which is great. But I would argue you can't control for them all. There are going to be backdoor paths. How do you deal with those? This is going to sound a bit pompous to say, but if these were economics papers, they wouldn't publish. We take causality very seriously, and just this kind of general I regress and I included some control variables and I hope this will be causal, that doesn't really fly anymore. I know that maybe all of this sounds overly critical of these papers, and maybe I am, right? I can be guilty of that as well. But the authors, importantly, do not venture to say that they have causal links here. They limit themselves to correlations, which is A+, right, for them. They are operating within the standards of their fields. That's fine. Just because I don't think it would publish in econ papers, clearly it is publishing in medical journals. But we need to be more demanding of our research methodologies, especially as more and more papers establish what I think are spurious correlations between Tylenol usage and ASD. The more of these papers come out, the more likely they are to be picked up by news reports or government agencies in justifying whatever agenda maybe they want to be pushing that day, or just to get people to look at their news. And that is the real issue. As more and more papers like this come out, that provides more and more fuel to the fire that, maybe Tylenol causes it, which again, does it? I don't think so. We don't know. We honestly would need to run an experiment or have really, really good quasi-experimental variation. I want to just really hammer that point home. This is just to say we need to do better. Scientists, in designing their research projects and kind of thinking about, what are the impacts of this, journal referees and holding these authors' feet to the fire to really make sure that they are solidly identifying what they say they are identifying, and policymakers for not making sweeping claims based on a very small body of research that, again, is correlational at best. There is real harm that will happen to pregnant women as a result of telling them they can't take Tylenol to deal with their pain while they're pregnant, right? We need to do better. They deserve better. I'll see you next time.